everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that's something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bells so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from California when a bubbly and intelligent young woman was found savagely stabbed to death in her own apartment in May of 1998. A police investigation and a search of her home revealed that her killer had accidentally left traces of himself behind at the crime scene. Despite this evidence and a couple of potential people of interest emerging in the case, unfortunately linking someone to this crime would prove to be difficult, meaning that this case eventually ended up going cold. And it remained that way for a long time, for years and years after her death, until finally police got the news they had been waiting for. The killer had been identified through DNA, and upon delving further into this man and his background, it was discovered that he was someone that had simply slipped through the cracks in the original investigation. He was someone that probably should have been on the detective's suspect list way back when the homicide occurred, but due to police mistakes, he was able to fly under the radar and get away with murder for well over a decade. Let's delve into the chilling case of Lisa Valdez. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video involves heavy themes such as sexual assault, and the theme of attempted suicide is also mentioned. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 27 years ago now to the spring of 1998 in Diamond Heights, which is a neighborhood located in central San Francisco in California in the US. And this is Lisa Christine Valdez. She was a 36-year-old woman who in the late 90s was living in Diamond Heights. Lisa was born on the 6th of September 1961 in San Francisco, so as far as I'm aware, she had lived in the city her whole life. She was born and raised there. Her mother was named Helen, and I couldn't actually find the name of Lisa's father because he wasn't really in the picture, to be honest. He and Helen had separated when Lisa was very young, and he didn't have much to do with his daughter following this, or his son. Lisa was one of two children. She had a big brother named Tom, and it would appear as though the kids, Lisa and Tom, were always very close with their mum Helen growing up. Helen was a single mother, and she worked so incredibly hard to provide for them. So as far as I'm aware, they both had a good, happy childhood, and Lisa grew up to become such a lovely young woman. Lisa's best friend was named Mesa. The two of them met in dance class when they were only in the 10th grade, and Mesa described how Lisa was always just this big ball of energy, this big ball of light. She was always so bubbly and lively and feisty. She was smiley and also just so incredibly caring. Mesa said that you could trust that Lisa would always be there for you no matter what. If you needed her help for whatever reason, whatever circumstance, she would be there. She was just an incredible friend, and Mesa described how Lisa was her, quote, ride or die before ride or die was even a thing. Lisa just seemed to be so full of life and so outgoing, and she was also highly intelligent too. She was so fascinated by all things technology and computers. She was so smart with that kind of thing and very ahead of her time. You know, her friends would recall how when emails started to become a thing, Lisa would get very excited and she would tell them all about it, and they had no idea what she was talking about, honestly. They had no clue what emails were, but Lisa would say things like, oh, you'll see, emails are going to be huge one day, and I mean, clearly she was right. So she knew that that was what she wanted to do with her life, the kind of field that she wanted to work in, and by the time this case occurred, she was working as a software analyst and a computer programmer for this big IT company in San Francisco. So she was very successful. She built a very good career for herself by 36 years old. And as well as having a good career, Lisa also had a very nice home. She had her own apartment in a really nice area in Diamond Heights. She moved into the apartment about 3 years before this case in 1994. It was a studio apartment, so it was quite small, but I mean, it was only Lisa living there, so it was definitely big enough for her. And she loved it. It had a beautiful view of the city, and she seemed to be settled there. She felt safe in her apartment building because she lived in a safe area of San Francisco, or at least what everyone thought was a safe area. That all changed when this case took place. place. The date was the 16th of May 1998. It was a Saturday, and that Saturday evening, 36-year-old Lisa Valdez had plans to host a bit of a get-together at her apartment for many of her family members. You see, it was her mother Helen's boyfriend's birthday, so kind of like Lisa's stepdad, I suppose, his birthday. And so Lisa decided to host a little dinner party at her apartment to celebrate. So all of her family members were invited, her guests came over, everyone seemed to have a really lovely time. And then when the party came to an end, all of the guests said goodbye and left Lisa's apartment, apart from her mother Helen. Helen decided to stay for a little while after the dinner party just to help her daughter clean and tidy up, and then around midnight 1 a.m. time, Helen left also, leaving Lisa in her apartment alone. I'm sure that Helen probably assumed that Lisa would just go to bed and that she was in for the night. She was none the wiser that in fact when she left that apartment, it would be the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. The following day, so the 17th of May 1998, Lisa was due to be going to a dance class, which is something that she did often. She absolutely loved to dance. However, she never actually turned up to this class. She just didn't show up that day. The other people at the class, her friends, didn't really think much of it. They just assumed that Lisa was probably busy or something, and so she didn't have time to attend that week. However, in addition to not showing up for the dance class, Lisa also wasn't responding to any calls. In the days after the dinner party, her mother Helen tried to contact Lisa at her apartment a number of times, but Lisa never picked up the phone, which seemed strange. Like I said, Lisa was always very close with her mum, so the fact that she seemed to be just ignoring her calls was very, very odd, very out of character. And what was also out of character, Lisa hadn't been turning up for work. It got to Wednesday, the 20th of May, so about 3-4 days after anyone had seen or heard from Lisa Valdez, 3-4 days after the dinner party, when Lisa's colleagues at her work got in touch with her mother Helen asking if Lisa was okay because she just hadn't shown up for her shifts the last few days, and she also hadn't contacted her work to let them know that she wouldn't be coming in, which again was very, very unusual for her. And so I think it was at that point when Helen just knew that something had to be wrong here. She became very concerned about her daughter, and so that same day, that Wednesday, Helen decided to head to her daughter's apartment in Diamond Heights to check that she was okay. However, when she got there, her concerns for Lisa's welfare just skyrocketed even more, because upon her arrival, she noticed that there were police there. There were police officers all around Lisa's apartment building. They were there because earlier that same day, they'd received a report that the dead body of a woman had been found in one of the apartments, and she had been the victim of a brutal homicide. That morning, the morning of the 20th of May 1998, other residents of Lisa's apartment building who lived on the same floor as her contacted the manager of the apartment building, notifying him that there was this awful, foul smell which they believed was coming from Lisa's apartment, apartment 307. So shortly before midday, the building manager went to Lisa's apartment to work out what this smell was. He knocked on her door, but he got no response, no one answered. And so he went to turn the handle and he realised that the door was unlocked, and so he pushed the door open, and that was when he was confronted with the most horrendous scene imaginable. Behind the door of Lisa's apartment, he saw her dead body lying on the floor and covered in blood. So he ran out of the apartment and immediately called the emergency services. Police officers were quickly dispatched to the scene, and as I said, this was soon deemed a homicide investigation that they were dealing with. It was clear to them that Lisa Valdez had been murdered, killed in her own home, and it was also clear that she had been dead for a while. I mean, as we know, no one had heard from her for days before her body was found, and now they knew why. It was because she lay dead inside of her apartment. The state of decomposition of her body suggested that she had been dead for days, hence the awful smell that the neighbours reported, and the temperature inside her apartment just advanced her decomposition even more. Apparently her thermostat was set at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, so it was very warm in there. Sources state that the television was also on when police arrived at the scene, the lights were switched on, and Lisa's body was found lying on the floor floor next to her bed, at the foot of her bed, and she was led on her back. She was kind of partially nude. Apparently her shirt was yanked up over her face, exposing her breasts, and I believe the bottom half of her body was completely exposed too. Her legs had also been spread apart, suggesting that she had probably been sexually assaulted by her killer, although this couldn't actually be confirmed when her autopsy was performed. Due to the fact that she was pretty badly decomposed by the time she was found, the coroner was just unable to determine whether or not she had been assaulted in that way. But again, given how her body had been positioned, it seemed more than likely that she had been assaulted and that the motive for the murder was sexual. As for her cause of death, as I mentioned, she was covered in blood when she was found, and there was blood in many areas of her apartment, suggesting that a violent struggle had occurred, although again, due to the advanced state of decomposition, it wasn't clear to police officers upon their arrival at the scene, just from looking at Lisa's body, how exactly she had died. They knew from the blood that again it was a very, very violent death, but they didn't know how she had been killed. The answer to that question would later come from her autopsy, where it was determined that she had been the victim of a vicious stabbing attack. No murder weapon was found at the scene, but it was established by the coroner that Lisa had been stabbed with a knife about 21 times in total, mainly in her upper body. She had stab wounds to her chest, her neck, her face. She had stab wounds to her jaw and her chin, cuts and wounds to her hands where she clearly tried to defend herself, raise her hands to fight off the attacker. But 3 of these stab wounds in particular were determined to have been fatal, as they penetrated major blood vessels, meaning that she would have bled out very, very quickly. I believe most of the blood in her apartment was kind of on and around her bed and her mattress where she was found, suggesting that that's where most of the struggle probably took place. Her bed sheets were covered in blood, her pillows were covered in blood, so all of those items were collected by investigators as evidence. But in addition to her being stabbed, something else that the police eventually determined about this crime was that the killer may have taken a trophy away with him after he murdered Lisa. That trophy was her hair. You see, Lisa always had this very, very long, dark hair. She had beautiful hair. In fact, everyone in her life would comment on it. She was very much known for her luscious locks. But chillingly, when her body was found, a huge amount of her hair was gone. It had been cut off. Her hair was around shoulder length, when normally it was down to literally around her knees. That's how long it was. So the perpetrator had cut a massive chunk off and taken it away with him. Again, was this a trophy? He wanted to take this hair as a keepsake, something that could always act as a reminder of what he had done to her. Lisa's murder was just absolutely horrific, so incredibly violent, and it's just heartbreaking to imagine the sheer terror that she was subjected to by her killer. She was attacked and viciously murdered in her own home, the place that should have been her safe haven, and this had happened to her. It's devastating and shocking. The community in Diamond Heights were absolutely shocked when news of this crime spread, because as I said earlier, it was previously thought to be a very safe, secure part of the city. Crimes like this just didn't happen here, but now everything had changed. Now the residents of Diamond Heights lived in fear because they had a killer amongst them. Upon looking around the rest of Lisa's apartment, the detectives could see no signs of forced entry anywhere. As we discussed, the door was unlocked when the apartment manager got there, so it seemed as though Lisa had most likely let her attacker inside, perhaps indicating that they were known to her. She wasn't killed by just a random stranger. She was murdered by someone that she knew and probably initially felt safe with. It also didn't appear as though anything had been stolen from her apartment, apart from apparently Lisa's keys and her gym bag were missing for some reason, but like nothing of value had been taken, none of her jewellery or cash or anything, so it didn't look like this was a burglary. The apartment was a little bit messy in areas, but it didn't seem like it had been ransacked, so yeah, this seemed to rule out the burglary / robbery gone wrong theory. But when had this happened? We know that Lisa had been dead for some time before her body was found, but police needed to work out a timeline here. When exactly had she been murdered? Well, we obviously know that the last time anyone saw Lisa Lisa was after the dinner party that she'd hosted at her apartment on the evening of the 16th of May. Her mother Helen helped to tidy up a little before she left her daughter's apartment shortly after midnight, so the early hours of the 17th of May. We also know that she didn't turn up for her dance class, which was supposed to be at midday on the 17th, so she must have been killed somewhere in that gap of time between her mother Helen leaving at midnight on the 17th and midday of the 17th because she didn't turn up to her dance class. And the police soon received some information from a neighbour of Lisa's which would allow them to pinpoint her likely time of death even more. This neighbour lived in an apartment directly below Lisa Valdez's, and she recalled how on the day that Lisa was killed at approximately 1:26 a.m. on the 17th of May, she heard a very, very loud thumping noise on her ceiling, which obviously would have been the floor of Lisa's apartment. I guess this neighbour didn't really think much of this noise at the time, but now that she had learned of Lisa's murder, she thought that she better inform the police. So thinking that this loud thumping noise may have been Lisa's murder taking place, police were able to establish that her likely time of death was around 1:30 in the morning on the 17th of May. 3 days before her body was found, and only about an hour or so after her mother Helen left the apartment following the dinner party. And as the police continued taking statements from neighbours and other people in Lisa's life, they discovered that someone may have actually stumbled upon the crime scene as the crime was happening without even realising it at the time. You see, Lisa had a cleaner, a house cleaner, who would come to her apartment every single Monday to tidy up for her. And Lisa would actually hang this envelope of cash on the back of her front door for the cleaner, just in case she wasn't home to pay her herself when the cleaner had finished, I suppose. Anyway, the police spoke to this cleaner and she informed them that on the morning of the 18th of May 1998, so the day after Lisa's death and 2 days before she was found, she headed to Lisa's apartment to clean as usual, as it was a Monday. However, she didn't make it fully inside the apartment because as she opened the door, she saw what she thought was Lisa lying naked on the floor, and she also heard a man's voice. She didn't see the man, but she heard his voice. Now, at the time, the cleaner literally thought that she had stumbled upon Lisa, I guess, having sex with this guy whose voice she could hear in the apartment. She thought that she had stumbled upon this intimate encounter, and so she very, very quickly shut the door and she left. But of course, we now know that Lisa was already dead by that point. Unbeknownst to her cleaner, that was Lisa's dead body on the floor. She literally only saw her for a split second, so she didn't even see or register the blood. But yeah, she'd seen Lisa's body, and that man that she heard in her apartment, well, it had to have been Lisa's killer. Clearly, the perpetrator had spent a good amount of time in Lisa's apartment with her body after he killed her. Clearly, he was in no rush to flee. He was still in there hours after she was dead. What he was doing in the apartment all that time, who knows? Although the police did find evidence that he had spent some time in Lisa's bathroom. You see, in the toilet bowl, they found 2 band-aids, like plasters, floating in the water. Perhaps these had come from the killer and he had cut himself with the knife during the violent struggle with Lisa. And in addition to that, something else that the police noticed about the toilet was that the toilet seat was up. Now, obviously, Lisa was a woman. She lived on her own. She would have had no reason to put the toilet seat up unless she was cleaning the toilet or something. So the police believed that it had been left up by the killer and that he'd obviously gone to the toilet whilst he was in Lisa's apartment. So with this theory in mind, the toilet seat was dusted for fingerprints, and on the underside of the seat were 2 partial fingerprints which were not a match to Lisa or any of Lisa's friends or family. These 2 partial fingerprints, the police believed, had to have come from her killer. They had the killer's fingerprints. And that wasn't the only forensic evidence the killer left behind. Like I mentioned, the band-aids in the toilet bowl suggested that the offender had most likely injured himself, cut himself during the murder. Now, unfortunately, scientists couldn't detect any traces of DNA on the band-aids themselves because they'd been submerged in the water for too long. But when scientists conducted tests on the blood that was found on other items at the scene, like the blood on Lisa's pillows, for example, they were able to find some blood droplets that weren't a match to her. It wasn't Lisa's blood, it was the blood of an unknown male. So again, this had to have come from her killer. As well as his fingerprints, the police also had his DNA. So this was big evidence in the case. And so in an effort to try and find a match to this DNA and these fingerprints, the police began the hunt for suspects, and they started looking into Lisa Valdez's love life, her former love interest, to work out whether anyone that she had been seeing or dating could have been responsible for this crime. And something that the police actually learned when they took statements from people in Lisa's life was that just the day after she was killed, she was due to go on a date with someone. Prior to her murder, she had been seeing this guy named Albert Cato. Now, apparently Albert actually ended up cancelling this date with Lisa before she was killed, but regardless, police became interested in him as a potential suspect. So he was asked to come down to the police station for an interview, which he did. He agreed to be interviewed, and interestingly, detectives actually noticed that Albert Cato had what looked like a fresh cut on one of his hands, which they became quite suspicious of because we know that the killer had cut himself during the struggle with Lisa because his blood was found in her apartment, and here was Albert Cato with a cut to his hand. He was asked to undergo a polygraph test, a lie detector test, which he agreed to. However, the results apparently indicated that Albert Cato was being deceptive during the test, which just added to the police's suspicion. However, of course, that wasn't solid evidence. The fact that his polygraph indicated deception and the fact that he had a cut to his hand does not prove that he was the one who did this. What would prove it, though, would be a DNA match. So police asked Albert Cato for his fingerprint samples and his blood samples to be able to compare against the killers, and as it would turn out, they did not match. Albert Cato couldn't have been the killer, so that was him eliminated as a suspect. Another suspect would eventually emerge in the case once detectives had listened to the recordings on Lisa's answering machine. You see, she had a lot of voicemails left on her machine by various different people, which had been left both before and after she was killed. But there was one voicemail in particular which stood out to the police. It was the 19th voicemail on her machine, and it had been made by a guy named Albert Robinson. Another Albert, he'd left a voicemail for Lisa on the 16th of May 1998 in which he said, quote, "You know how it goes, Takita. Hello, Lisa, are you home?" Now, it turns out that Albert Robinson was a colleague of Lisa's. He worked with her, and as far as she was concerned, that was the extent of their relationship. They were just co-workers, and I guess maybe friends too. However, Albert Robinson viewed their relationship very differently, it seems. He had a crush on Lisa, a big crush on her. In fact, people said that he was literally infatuated with Lisa, and he wanted them to be more than friends. He wanted them to be a couple, but again, she wasn't interested in him like that. So she would often kind of let him down gently. But could that mean that Albert Robinson had a motive? If he was the one who killed Lisa, did he do it because she rejected him and he decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one else could? So Albert Robinson very much became kind of the prime suspect in the investigation. The police searched his house to see if they could find anything in there which linked him to the crime. And whilst they didn't necessarily find any like hard evidence, what they did find in his home was a load of pictures of Lisa. There were pictures of her everywhere in his house, which just showed his infatuation and obsession with her even more. In fact, apparently something else that the police found in his home was a load of porn magazines, and he'd even put pictures of Lisa on the pages of these magazines. So he was scarily obsessed with her, and remember, she was literally just his co-worker, nothing more. There was nothing sexual or romantic going on between them whatsoever. Apparently his behaviour after Lisa was murdered was also just very strange. He behaved very strangely at her funeral. So it wasn't just the police who became suspicious of Albert Robinson. Lisa's friends and family did too. Albert Robinson was interviewed and he denied any involvement in Lisa's murder. He said that he never would have done anything to hurt her. However, he apparently had no alibi for the night of the killing, because I think he said that he was just home alone, so there was no one that could confirm that. And when he underwent 2 polygraph tests, the results were inconclusive. So I think he essentially didn't fail, but he also didn't pass these lie detectors. So he really was looking like a good suspect. I think the police became pretty damn convinced that Albert Robinson was the perpetrator. They'd found the killer. That was until they made the DNA comparison, and to their surprise, just like Albert Cato, he wasn't a match. Albert Robinson's DNA did not match the fingerprint on Lisa's toilet seat, nor did it match the profile of the male DNA, the blood on her pillow. So Albert Robinson was also eliminated. Following the launch of the CODIS database in the US in late 1998, the DNA of Lisa's killer was uploaded onto there in search for a match, but unfortunately there wasn't one. And tragically, as the months continued to pass, the police just reached a bit of a halt with the investigation. They reached a point where they didn't really have anything to go on anymore. The tips and leads had dried up, all people of interest and suspects had been ruled out, and they just didn't really have any other avenues to go down to try and identify the perpetrator, which resulted in the case of Lisa Valdez eventually turning cold. Years started to pass by with next to no movement in the case, leaving Lisa's family and friends heartbroken, obviously, as they started to believe that the case would probably never be solved, that Lisa would never get justice for her brutal death, that her killer would never face punishment. In fact, Lisa's brother, Tom Valdez, described how his and Lisa's mother, Helen, struggled so much with her grief after her daughter was killed, that even someone, a stranger, saying to her something like, "Have a nice day," would cause her to just break down into tears. How could she possibly have a nice day knowing that the man who took her daughter's life was still out there somewhere, still free to roam the streets when Lisa was gone forever? Over a decade passed by, and around 2009 time, Lisa's cold case was handed over to a new detective to investigate, homicide detective Pamela Hofsass with the San Francisco Police Department, and she would kind of check in with the people at the CODIS lab every few months or so, just asking if there had been a match to the DNA of Lisa's killer yet, but every time they said no. Pam and other detectives continued following up on the DNA, and in 2010, the team learned of a relatively new DNA technique called familial DNA testing, whereby you could search the CODIS database for potential relatives of an offender using their DNA profile. So Detective Hofsass began to wonder whether that could be of use in Lisa's murder. They couldn't find an exact match to her killer on CODIS, but would they find a partial match, a relative of his, and they could whittle down the search for him that way? So the team gave the killer's DNA profile over to CODIS to search for a familial match, which took Detective Hofsass about a year or so to do. To put together this familial DNA request, it took her from about 2010 to 2011, but she sent off this request, and then in September of 2011, Detective Hofsass received a phone call. It was from scientists at the CODIS lab, and they informed her that they had good news for Pam and bad news for her. The bad news was that they had decided they weren't going to be conducting a familial search in relation to the Lisa Valdez case, because the good news was that a match, an exact match to the killer's DNA, had just come up. They just had a hit. Someone's DNA had recently been entered onto CODIS, and it matched the DNA of the man that murdered Lisa Valdez. After more than 13 years of searching, the killer had been identified. Detective Hofsass was informed that the match was to a man named Anthony Quinn Hughes, who was around 52 years old and who had been arrested in San Francisco just 2 months earlier in the summer of 2011 for shoplifting. Now, Anthony Quinn Hughes had actually been arrested a number of times before. He had a pretty lengthy criminal record of, I believe, mainly theft-related offences, and he had served time in prison. However, he'd never been required to submit his DNA profile prior to this latest offence that he was arrested for, due to the fact that none of the crimes he committed were necessarily of a violent nature. In California, only people who had been arrested and convicted of violent crimes were required to give their DNA sample for the CODIS database. That was until the law in California was changed in 2004, Proposition 69, which expanded the type of offenders who would be required by law to provide their DNA and prints upon arrest. Now, those arrested for theft and robbery would also have to give a sample. And so that is exactly what happened when Anthony Quinn Hughes was arrested for shoplifting in July of 2011. His DNA was taken, it was uploaded onto CODIS, and in September of that same year, it flagged up as a match to the DNA profile of Lisa Valdez's killer. And that wasn't all. When the detectives got a hold of Anthony Quinn Hughes's fingerprint samples and they compared those to the partial prints that had been left by the killer on Lisa's toilet seat, they too were a match. Hughes matched the prints and he matched the blood left behind by the killer. So finally, police were on the right track. They'd found their guy. Now, the name Anthony Quinn Hughes wasn't one that the police were familiar with in relation to the Lisa Valdez case. He'd never been looked at as a suspect before. However, he was known to Lisa. The two did know each other. Anthony Hughes's name was actually in Lisa's address book, and it turns out that they went to high school together. They were pretty good friends in high school and were even more than friends at one point. Apparently, old friends of Lisa's told the police that she used to date this guy who she called Huggy, and it's believed that that was Hughes. Lisa used to call him Huggy. But a brief high school romance seemed to be kind of the extent of their relationship, really. Like I said, he was never considered a suspect in the original investigation back in 1998 when Lisa was killed, because high school was like 20 years prior. Lisa was 36 years old, although it kind of seemed like he should have been looked at as a suspect. You see, something that the detectives working on Lisa's case in 2011 discovered was that Anthony Quinn Hughes was one of the many people that had left a voicemail on Lisa Valdez's answering machine around the time of her murder. Apparently, he'd called her house phone on the 18th of May 1998, the day after she was killed, and he left just a pretty generic message. Now that we know he was the murderer, it seems obvious, doesn't it, that he did that in an attempt to almost cover his tracks, make people think that he couldn't have been the killer because he'd left a voicemail on her answering machine after her death, acting as if she was still alive, if you know what I mean. But I mean, the police back in 1998 never even followed up on Anthony Quinn Hughes, because apparently he was like the 22nd voicemail on her answering machine, and for some unknown reason, the original detectives only followed up on the voicemails that had been left by the first 19 people. I think they stopped when they got to Albert Robinson's voicemail, because as we discussed earlier, they were so convinced for a while that he was the perpetrator, so they didn't bother looking into all of the people that had left messages on the machine after him. Had they done that, had they looked into Anthony Quinn Hughes sooner, well, this case would have been solved sooner, but they didn't. So clearly that was a huge mistake on the police's part. But anyway, 13 years on, in the fall of 2011, and finally the police had their match, and so they immediately started trying to track down Anthony Quinn Hughes. Now, this would prove to be quite difficult because he didn't really have a permanent address. He was a bit of a transient in San Francisco, so they had no idea where to find him. He was always on the move, it seems. And so what detectives decided to do was basically show a picture of him to all plainclothed police officers who were kind of patrolling around areas in San Francisco that Hughes was known to often go to, and just asked them to keep an eye out for him. And thankfully, it didn't take long for some of these officers to spot him. On the 10th of September 2011, Anthony Quinn Hughes just walked right past them. He was actually jaywalking, so they approached him, arrested him, and he was taken into custody. Following his arrest, the detectives who were dealing with the Lisa Valdez investigation met with him. According to one source, they initially acted as though they wanted to talk to Hughes about a string of burglaries that had happened around the Diamond Heights area where obviously Lisa lived and was murdered. I guess so that his guard wouldn't be immediately up. So they sat down with him, they introduced themselves, they started asking him questions about the apartment complex in Diamond Heights where Lisa lived. Did he recognize it? Had he ever been there before? And he said no. He said that none of it looked familiar to him. And then eventually they started speaking to him about Lisa. They got out a picture of Lisa and asked him if he recognized her. And initially he actually said no, but then when the detectives told him her name, said this is Lisa Valdez, he changed his answer. He said, oh yeah, he did recognize Lisa. He knew her from high school, that they dated briefly in high school. He said that they had a bit of a romance for a little while, but that they eventually split up. And Hughes claimed that the last time he saw Lisa Valdez was in like the late 80s, a whole decade before she was killed. He said that he didn't see her at all in 1998, the year that she died. Anthony Quinn Hughes told the detectives that he recalled bumping into Lisa when she was at college in the late 80s. She attended the Mills College in Oakland, California. They obviously hadn't seen each other since high school, so they got chatting, had a catch up, and Hughes said that Lisa ended up inviting him back to her dorm room. And Hughes told the detectives that one thing he remembered about Lisa's dorm room was that her bed was just a complete mess. It was very, very messy and untidy. And he claimed that that was when Lisa told him that she had just had sex with 6 different guys in that bed, which he said made him feel very disgusted and angry. He was disgusted that she'd been sleeping around in college, and he decided then that he didn't really want to see Lisa Valdez ever again. He was that sickened by her behaviour. Whether that is actually true though, who knows? He could have been making that up, let's be honest. But even if it was true and Lisa really did say that, I mean, she was a single girl in college enjoying herself, so she is well within her rights to do whatever she wanted. But perhaps that could have been a possible motive for Hughes carrying out this crime. He had once dated Lisa, so was he jealous? Was he angry that she had been sleeping with other guys and decided to later kill her as revenge? Now, it's not actually known how they came to reconnect again in 1998. None of Lisa's friends or family knew that she had come into contact with Anthony Quinn Hughes again. And like I said, he tried to claim in his interview that he had never been to her apartment complex and that he hadn't seen her since the late 80s, a decade before her murder. And so the police confronted him with the DNA evidence. If he hadn't seen her for 10 years and he'd never been to her apartment, then how could he explain the fact that his fingerprints were found on her toilet seat and his blood was found on her pillows after she was killed? And he couldn't really offer an explanation. Hughes just kind of broke down. He started crying. He was saying things like, what is this all about? And you think I killed Lisa? No, I did not kill Lisa. He was getting very, very upset, and then eventually he asked the detectives if he could have a pen. He wanted something that he could write with, and the detectives actually thought when he asked that, okay, this is it. He's going to write some kind of confession. Maybe he doesn't want to say that he murdered Lisa out loud. He wants to write it down. But they were wrong. Once they handed him a pen, he didn't proceed to write anything down. He actually began trying to stab himself with it. He started trying to jab it in his chest and in his stomach and in his neck, right in front of the detectives. Of course, they jumped up and immediately began trying to stop him. And as all of this was going on, he was saying things like, I want to die, I want to die. He said, you guys are trying to pin something on me, I didn't do it. The police managed to wrestle the pen off of Hughes, and he was put on suicide watch in a hospital for a while. And of course, he was charged. Despite his protests that he was innocent, he was charged with the first-degree murder of 36-year-old Lisa Valdez. And Lisa's friends and family finally received the news that they had been waiting for more than 13 years, that her killer had been found and he'd been arrested. Lisa was finally going to get justice. Anthony Quinn Hughes went to trial in December of 2015, having pleaded not guilty. It was the prosecution's case, their theory, that Hughes went to Lisa's apartment on the night of the 17th of May 1998. She happily let him inside because he was an old acquaintance of hers, and they'd clearly reconnected at some point in the lead up to her death. Again, how and exactly when they reconnected, we don't know. But he went to her apartment that night, and it's believed that he probably tried it on with Lisa. He tried to initiate something, maybe sex, and when she rejected him, he turned violent and decided to stab her to death. We know that he spent a significant amount of time with her dead body in her apartment after the murder. He'd clearly been injured himself during the struggle, and so he had to use band-aids. He used the toilet. He cut off Lisa's hair, again presumably to take away as a trophy, and then when he eventually left her apartment, he just tried to carry on his life as normal for the next 13 years, clearly completely unfazed and unbothered by what he had done, the fact that he had callously taken the life of an innocent young woman. According to court documents, the defense tried to claim during the trial that Hughes was innocent of this crime because he was physically incapable of carrying out such a violent attack. Apparently, about 5 years before Lisa's death in 1993, he had been diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder called myasthenia gravis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, apologies if not. But that causes muscle weakness, and he'd also sustained a shoulder injury, and he would occasionally have chest pain. So yeah, they said that he couldn't have possibly committed such a violent crime because he didn't have the strength or the stamina. He wouldn't have been able to overpower Lisa to kill her. However, his medical records from 1998 were brought up during the trial. Apparently he had been examined by a doctor in 98, the same year Lisa was killed. And whilst, yes, he did have MG and he did have these injuries and these health issues, his medical records stated that Hughes's symptoms were well managed and well controlled with the medication that he was on. So it wasn't like he was unable to do anything. Still seemed as though he would have been very physically able to carry out this crime. And of course, the DNA evidence proved that he had. When the trial came to a close, the jury was sent off to deliberate, and in January of 2016, they came back with a verdict of guilty. They had found Anthony Quinn Hughes guilty of the 1998 murder of Lisa Valdez. Now, he was originally convicted of murder in the first degree. However, when it came to his sentencing, the judge actually decided to reduce this to murder in the second degree. I guess because in his eyes, there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove that this was premeditated. So yeah, he was convicted of second degree murder and he was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. According to reports, Hughes had also been charged with attempted rape in relation to Lisa's case, but again, there was insufficient evidence and a mistrial was declared on that charge. So he was just convicted of second degree murder and sent off to prison. He was sent to the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California, where I believe he remains as of right now. And that concludes this case, the shocking case of Lisa Valdez. Such a brutal, brutal crime, and it's so heartbreaking that, again, Lisa was killed in the place where she should have felt the most safe, her own apartment. It should have been her safe haven, but Anthony Hughes took her life there. I really hope that he remains in prison for a very long time because the thought of him ever being let out is terrifying, quite honestly. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them down in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!